Right, good morning. Good to see you all. Good to be here. This is the second time I'm going to start a presentation with an apology. So, as you get older, you sort of, the first thing that goes is your memory. So, you end up having to have notes. When you travel a lot, the second thing that goes is you get jet lag. So you have to have a script. When you've got a script and you've got notes, then the third thing that goes is your eyesight. So you have to have glasses to see your notes. And when you've got glasses, the last thing that goes is somehow the length of your arm shortens. So you end up having to have longer arms and not being able to use the glasses to see the notes that you don't follow anyway. So I apologize for being an old, jet-lagged, blind, short-armed presenter to you all. And my apologies. Right, what I was going to do is, that's not me, that's me. So, what I was going to do was talk to you about, partly about my experience in Lenovo, partly about my experience outside of Lenovo in looking at this whole concept of the sort of digital age and the impact that the digital age is having on supply chains. And so what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to look at some of the key disruptors that are happening in the world. I'm then going to sort of look from a leadership perspective. So a leader in supply chain, we're all leaders in supply chain. So from a leader in supply chain's perspective, the sort of things that organizations are having to do. And I've got a list of about 8. I'll just focus on 3 or 4 because I don't think we've got the time. And if we do have the time, then you can ask me the questions about the others. Let me give you a bit of my background. So my background was, I've been in supply chain for 27 years. The last 8, up until October last year, was as SVP in Lenovo, where I ran end-to-end supply chain in Europe. I ran logistics and manufacturing logistics, so everything that moved in the network, which is about $1.4 billion logistics spend. And the last couple of years I ran mergers and acquisitions from a supply chain perspective, analytics, and supply chain strategy. So I've done 3 different roles. Before that, I worked in DHL as I ran a big international product for DHL. I worked in Danzas in automotive and retail. I worked in the original Excel Logistics, if any of you remember that. When it had just been formed, I joined them. It had been formed from the National Freight Consortium, and everybody's going blank now because nobody's as old as me. So a role that's sort of, a career that sort of spanned all of that. In October, I just decided that corporate life wasn't for me, and I left. And since then, I've been doing some pretty, working with a number of systems companies, working with a number of 3PLs, working with a number of shippers, just looking at some of this stuff, some of the digital, not really, the disruptive impacts on their supply chain. So, let me go first. So, the first thing that sort of I think I started to notice in the last 5 years is that our world is changing really, really fast. And it was really interesting. I put this up every time, and I saw there was a little, I think it's a Japanese lady downstairs who came across the big buffet of food and started taking photographs of the buffet of food. And I'm thinking, what's it? My daughter does it. Every time I take my daughter out for a meal, she photographs the food and puts it onto whatever it is, WhatsApp or WeChat or whatever the thing is. So the way we see the world's changing fast. And I don't know if you've noticed, but suddenly it's become a pretty complicated, a pretty serious, and a pretty scary place again. And that's happened quite quickly. That's happened in probably the last 2 years. So the world around us in supply chain is changing dramatically. And that's having an impact, and it's changing supply chain. So what you're seeing is this tsunami, and I like the word, tsunami of change. It's creating this tsunami of things that are happening to supply chain. And the reality is the rate at which things are happening and things are changing in supply chains means that most of our organizations have to learn to swim pretty quickly. In fact, we have to learn to surf pretty quickly, because if you swim in a tsunami, you die anyway. I think that there are three things that most people tend to, when they talk about disruption in supply chain, most people tend to just focus on that one, the digital disruption. I think it's three things happening at the same time. I think there's an enormous cultural, socio-economic, geopolitical change going on in the world at the moment. People are changing. What people want out of the world is changing. That's sort of driven by and driving digital disruption. So there's a load of new technology out there that's really changing what we can do, how we can do it, when we can do it, and how easily we can do it. I think the third thing that's happening is there's more availability of capital. So if you want to start up a company, it's fairly simple. You go onto Kickstarter, and you don't even have to have a product. You just go onto Kickstarter, get the money, and then create the product. So you've got this change in the way that sort of finances work to deliver new businesses. And then there's this, I call it financial power. There's now these 3 or 4 massive e-coms in the world that are effectively, are they disruptors or are they destroyers? I don't know, but they basically bully the supply chain and business into the direction that they want to go in. And the reality is they don't get measured in the same way as most of us get measured. You know, you look at the new startups, they don't have to make any profit. They just have to increase the value of their organizations and then sell their organizations on. So it's a very different world. So as leaders, we're facing this set of seismic disruptions. And I'm going to talk in terms of this as a leader. So as leaders, our role is to sort of navigate our businesses and our organizations through that whole transformation process that we're going to go through. So, just going to go through what I think those key disruptors are. So, firstly, this sort of socio-economic, cultural, geopolitical stuff that's happening. Firstly, supply chains. You see in this concept of supply chains becoming absolutely global. Even if you're a tiny, tiny organization, you have to have a global supply chain now, which means they're getting very, very, very complex. You know, you go on Etsy, the ETSY, where you can literally buy a hat made by somebody that's sitting in their house in Sweden, knitting it. But it's a global supply chain. You can buy it from anywhere in the world, and it gets delivered from anywhere in the world. Product life cycles are shortening. You look at Apple's a great example. Apple, you used to get one phone from Apple each year, and they sold it because it was Apple. Now you get one phone every 6 months, and there are probably 4 versions of it. Okay, there's a 6, a 6S, a 6S Special, and a 6S large format. So more and more and more products into the marketplace because the product life cycle is shortening. And you've got this, I talked about it this morning, you've got this massive supply volatility and enormous demand variability happening at the same time. So the two ends of that, the usual supply-demand chain that we all didn't find easy, but were able to forecast using, is now sort of slightly out of control. So that's the first thing. And then the thing about, what to talk this morning about digital melting the supply chain, everybody can speak to everybody now in the supply chain. Everybody can sell to everybody in the supply chain. The second thing is the consumer. So I've called this consumer democracy. I think there's this distinct rise of consumers getting intimately involved in the supply chain now. You know, you buy a Porsche. It's made in somewhere in America, and you can, if you want to, you can get a message from Porsche that says, "Oh, we're putting the wheels on there. Oh, we're just about to fit the radio." You know. The steering mechanism has now gone in. You've got that level of involvement now in the sort of supply chain. So massive consumer democracy. And basically the consumer wants what they want, where they want it, when they want it, how they want it. It's got to be ethical. It's got to be probably customized in some way. And by the way, they're not going to pay for it. They're not going to pay anything to get it in that way. And that's having this impact of ever-increasing choice at zero cost. So that's having an impact. I don't know if you've noticed it, of devaluing speed and devaluing the cost of a delivery. And it's interesting, it's almost like Amazon, when they started doing this, opened this box, and it's Pandora's box, and everything's come out, and now it's impossible to put the lid back on the thing. Because you as a consumer will say, why would I pay for a delivery tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. that I want to change to 9, 10 a.m. to my work? What on earth would I pay for that for? So, devaluation of speed and cost. Omnichannel, I said this morning, omnichannel and the e-com boom. Omnichannel is slowly sneaking upstream. In tech, in Lenovo, we were finding it. We were finding we had to change the way that we were making things, manufacturing things, because the demand for those things was changing. So we were having to look at how do we make short runs of this product? Because if we make a massive run of this PC and we create 100,000 and the demand's only little bits, the various different parts, it sort of gives us an inventory problem. And then that thing, we spoke about the Amazon bullwhip effect, and it's not just Amazon, the e-com bullwhip effect. So somebody agreeing to deliver something for nothing at a specific time adds complexity and adds cost into the supply chain. Amazon or the e-com says, well, we're not paying for that, so they pass it upstream. The next person says, well, we're not paying for that, and they pass it upstream. And there's this bullwhip effect of cost and complexity that just goes right the way back along the supply chain, and somebody has to deal with it. And the last thing is we're living in this ever-changing world. 65% of the gross domestic product of the world will reside in 600 cities by 2025. Okay, so you imagine what that does to your delivery processes, what that does to your B2C processes. Suddenly you've got to have some sort of a city logistics strategy to deal with that process. You've got this crazy process with oil and the stock market in the last 5 years, last 3 years in reality. Usually when oil drops, the stock market goes up. Actually now, oil drops and the stock market drops. And it's quite a bizarre, and I think it's to do with sort of social media. I think it's to do with the fact that people just panic when they see the oil price drop, and they therefore devalue stock, and that goes down at the same time. And then all this geopolitical instability, the Middle East and Africa, India as a source, India as a destination, China becoming a destination itself. This whole thing that China's trying to do of convert itself from a manufacturing economy to a buying, to a procuring economy, a purchasing economy, a consumer economy. So these big changes in sort of culture, massive changes in tech, in the way that digital's helping us to do things. And I won't spend too long on these because you've seen all these, but the importance of data and analytics. 40 zettabytes of data will go through our networks, our ecosystems, by the year 2020. That's 40 followed by 21 zeros. 80% of that will be unstructured. 20% of it will be structured. We actually use about 0.5% of that to do any analytics with. So this massive amount of data, and we're using a tiny portion of it. And you're seeing people now talking about creating these things called data lakes. And a data lake is somewhere that you basically dump all your data that you don't know. You may want to use it in the future, but you don't want to use it now. So you dump your data to store it in this big reservoir. Cognitive machine learning analytics. You see all the impact. Amazon, another impact of Amazon. Amazon now have got a process whereby they look at your buying behavior, and they can actually decide to move something to your postcode before you've actually bought it, on the sort of predictive process that you're going to buy it at some point. And interestingly, if you don't buy it then, the plan is that they'll then offer it you for a 20% discount. So they almost drive the market in the direction they want to drive it. So analyzing, collecting, handling data becomes almost a key part of our role in supply chain. Easy systems, the cloud, massive processing power. Systems, you'll see from some of the systems you'll see in the room next door. Systems have become far easier, they've become far gooier, they've become cheaper, they've become pay-as-you-go. You don't any longer have to go and rely on a massive SAP implementation to do things. And we've seen some of the impacts of SAP implementations going wrong. The cost is immense. It's like in the hundreds of millions, near the billions, if these things go wrong. So now you can build stuff outside in. You don't have to build stuff inside out anymore. You don't have to rely on your ERP to do all the connecting of everything. You can build stuff on the outside. Big growth of Uberization. Yeah. And it's not just Uber, but all the Uber-type platforms that are starting to build. The Airbnb, the sort of, you know, the largest taxi company in the world doesn't own any taxis. The largest real estate company in the world doesn't own any real estate. And all those things happening, this sort of effectively using existing assets to provide a service to somebody else. And that Uberization now coming into air and ocean, you're starting to see Uber themselves doing transport, road transport, but you're starting to see Uber-type platforms in air and Uber-type platforms in ocean. And that's driving a new approach to the way we live our lives as well. You go into any airport now, you walk through the airport, at the outside of the airport, there's 6 or 7 of these, you know, an office for an hour. You use an office for an hour and then you go somewhere else. And that's the way that our lives are sort of changing. We're becoming quite sort of Uberized in our lives. And we've even invented a new verb as in Uber. Is it a verb or an adjective? I don't know which one it is. Robots and automation. So 2.3 million robots in the US by the end of this decade. 1 million Foxbots. So Foxconn make all of Apple's computers, and a lot of Lenovo's and some of HP's. And they make them all in China. They're going to have 1 million Foxbots in their manufacturing plants in the next 10 years, which just shows you the way the whole world is changing. Google buying robotics companies. Drones and self-driving vehicles. So drones, you saw all the stuff about Amazon and the sort of the drones and the FAA and the fact that it's, you know, But ultimately, drones will happen. Ultimately, they will, and they're already being used, I think. So DHL are using them in parts of northern Germany. They're being used in Africa to deliver to certain parts of Africa. In Singapore now, when they build a building, they build a drone pad on top of the building so that you can deliver to the top of the building. So that ultimately they'll happen. The big thing that will happen will be autonomous vehicles first, I would think. The interesting thing is what drones do is they separate, just in the way that when we used to write a letter, we had to have an address, and it would be delivered to your address. When email came along, the address was you. Wherever you were, that was your address. And that's what drones will start to do. They'll start to separate the sort of consumer, the customer, from the physical address, because the address will ultimately be you, your position and your digital position. And lastly, 3D printing and the Internet of Things, which 3D printing has increased by 30% year on year, the market, for the last 3 years. And the impact of 3D printing on things like spare parts logistics. You know, you think about creating spare parts for a computer. If you can just print that spare part, you end up with this thing called a zero-length supply chain. You end up with a supply chain that doesn't have any length at all. The supply chain becomes a piece of data that moves around, and the printer, when you want the new cover for this, you go with your cue card or your barcode to the printer. He prints it and you fit it. And then 30 billion Internet of Things devices by 2020. And the impact of Internet of Things, if you just start to think about the impact of everything, knowing what it is, where it's going, where it's coming from, what it has to do to be at a certain place, all talking to each other. And I know that's probably science fiction, but you think about the impact of that, it's tremendous. And then lastly, what we spoke about with the industry changing. So startups, new venture capital models. It just means that it's very easy now to get into our industry, into supply chain, into logistics. The vast majority, I think it's, 0.2% of all startups 5 years ago were in logistics. It's now 1.4% of all startups are in logistics. Because the barriers of entry to our industry have gone down tremendously. And you can see the impact of that in the whole industry is getting very, very crowded, in as much as it's not just the old DHLs, it's now DHLs, it's people like Flextronics who've decided to get into the industry. It's Uber who are getting into the industry, it's Google, it's Amazon, it's eBay, Alibaba that are getting into the industry. So new startups, new venture capital models. And then the power of cash and size. So Amazon have got this, just every single week now, something else comes out about Amazon. They've just doubled the number of airplanes they've got in the USA. They've bought themselves a shipping license in China, so they can now be an NVOCC. They bought Wilmington Airport off DHL, so they can do their own parcel deliveries in America. You can see that they're slowly deciding to become a supply chain organization, a logistics organization. And they have this concept of own it all. So when Amazon wants something, they buy it. And interestingly, if you compare that to Alibaba want to control it all. They don't buy it, they create systems and they create processes that sort of control it all. And the response from the logistics market is to acquire it all. You're going to see this new wave of logistics companies buying logistics companies to try and get to the size where they can compete with the Amazons of this world, which is interesting in itself. You say compete with the Amazons of this world. That's quite a strange thing to say. They're disrupting markets. They're disrupting, well, are they disrupting digitally or are they just disrupting because of their sheer power and their sheer size? And I think it's because of their sheer power and their sheer size. They're deciding the way that a supply chain goes, the way that a market goes, and they're able to do that because they're so big. And then finally, you've got this massive explosion of the mobile economy. This hyper-connected world, all connected by mobile applications and mobile processes. All about data on the move, all about the growth of the phone for everything. And if you can see that blue line is the sale of PCs. The black line is the sale of phones over the same period. And I think that is something like, that was 5 years ago. So you can see that the sale of phones has just rocketed, whereas the sale of PCs is almost flatlined. So, a number of things happening. 12 key disruptors. I think 10 new approaches that leaders have got to take in the supply chain. Firstly, we've got to start to look at supply chain analytics and data. We've got to start to create in supply chain these centers of excellence which use data and drive decisions using data. The second thing we've got to do is we've got to look at our networks, because our networks are going to change, okay? They're going to have to become more agile. They're going to have more inventory. They're going to have to be able to finish something at the last possible stage. I think the strategic relationships with logistics partners are going to change. You know, if logistics is commoditizing incredibly quickly, you know, freight, trucking, air freight is just commoditizing in front of our eyes. So our relationship with them is going to have to change. We're going to have to start to look, we talked about this morning, this concept of collaboration. That's where the value is now. The value is in collaboration. We've got to start to look at the new technology, the stuff I started to talk about, you'll see board, you know, some containers, this new online freight forwarding, that sort of stuff we've got to start to look at. New control structures, so the way we control our networks and our supply chains are going to change. We're going to have new talents and new skills, because all of this means new people. It means different people that can do different things. And then finally, we've got to start to think about how we develop this thing called a digital strategy that sits alongside our normal strategy, that talks about how are things going to change digitally over the next few years. Now, I haven't got that much time, so I'll try and finish this. So I was going to focus on 4 things. Let me do it very quickly. We talked a lot about data this morning. We talked about big data. I don't know what big data is. But basically, data, analytics, will have a massive impact on us. And I said this morning about how in Lenovo we'd taken on this small group of guys that almost revolutionized the way that we looked at value in our supply chain. So big changes in that. You know, you've got to think about how you create these centers of excellence for data. The second thing, the networks, okay? Again, we talked a little bit about this out-of-sync process that's happening now between supply and demand. You know, what used to be a really easy skipping process is now a process that's all over the place. And that's driving a massive requirement for agility, and it's driving a massive requirement for flexibility in the supply chain. And that's creating a new type of network. People talk about the impact of digital disruption. It actually has a physical impact on our networks. So more and more people having to look at the sustainability of the raw materials. More and more people having to have absolute end-to-end visibility all the way back to the component. Managing tech now, the big thing is to start to manage your inbound to manufacturing. Because if you get that wrong, you can't make the product, you therefore can't fulfill your order. Further up the chain, looking at how you manufacture, so short-run manufacturing, additive manufacturing, the impact of 3D printing, automation and robots, the impact of that on where you source. I was talking to Huawei the other day, and they've now decided to make, they make a vanilla PC in China, they move that to Panama, they store all of this vanilla product to Panama, an unfinished PC, and then they drop the order on Panama. For the whole of the Caribbean, some of the southern states of the USA, and the whole of Latin America. So basically, they can make a final decision at the last possible point in the supply chain to fulfill an order. The whole complexity now driving where you put stock, where you finance inventory, where you collaborate. So now inventory now has got to become, it used to be a really dirty word in tech. You say the word inventory in a meeting in technology and people would literally stone you. You'd be thrown out of the room. Now they're having to think about inventory as a positive thing, as a positive process, because you're having to hold strategic inventory to meet these ridiculously, variable demand processes. And then right at this end, the whole impact of omni-channel, the fact you're going to have to start to look at new partners and new models for delivering your product. So if you're a retailer now, you're probably looking at Uber as a way of delivering your product in a city. The other thing I was going to speak about, which I'll talk about very rapidly, is this whole new control structure. I think that in the old world, if you wanted to control your entire end-to-end supply chain, you went down the route of talking to a 3PL about putting a 4PL or an LLP in place for you. They would come along and they'd say, it's okay, we'll deal with all of this, we'll create all this control, we'll create the one version of the truth. The reality is now, data is absolutely key to you guys. They say it's the new oil, but data's a really valuable component in your networks. The supply chain is absolutely strategic. The impact of the supply chain is probably a USP to your organization. So more and more, you're going to want to create this control structure for your network, but you're going to want to create it and internalize it. Okay, you're going to want to own it. So a lot of people now, you look at a lot of companies now, they're going down this route of creating control towers, service centers, centers of excellence, whatever you call it, but creating them from the perspective of them being in-house, them being owned. And this is what we did in Lenovo. So we created 7 different service centers based on region and based on product. Those service centers gave us this sort of control tower capability from one point in the supply chain. They allowed us to start to measure some really, really cool stuff. And they created, over a 5-year period, they created $1 billion of savings in the network over 5 years. If you look at, interesting. So you look at the way that now networks tend to work. They tend to be unconnected. They tend to be disparate systems that sort of disappeared again. Disparate systems that sort of speak to each other with Excel spreadsheets. The reality is now, and go and take a look at this, systems like Board actually give you the ability to connect all this stuff in the supply chain and present it as a single entity to your control tower. So you don't have to now have these disparate systems all creating an Excel spreadsheet, looking at that spreadsheet, going to that spreadsheet, going to that spreadsheet. There are systems like Board that actually create that single view for you. And they create sort of really cool dashboards that allow you to look at an element of the supply chain and the health of that element and click on that and go into a lot more detail and see what's happening further down in that KPI. Systems that, views that give you absolute visibility of what's happening anywhere in the supply chain and the ability to say, I don't like that, click on that, let's see what's happening in that area. Systems that create these very interactive dashboards for you on a regular basis. Not just the sort of view now of, I get it once a week, but an interactive one that's almost online. Last thing I wanted to quickly talk about was strategy. I'll whip through this. I think one of the things that you all need to start to think about as leaders in supply chain is how you take what we've talked about, all that digital stuff that we've talked about, and you create a strategy for that digital stuff, okay? We're all used to creating a business strategy. A lot of these things now, 3D printing, drones, driverless trucks, are going to have an impact on us. Maybe not in the time scale that we think they're going to have an impact on us, but ultimately they're going to have an impact on us. So what I've been working with a number of companies on now is how you plot that impact against time so that you suddenly start to get this area of impact, this area of influence on your overall strategy. And what companies that are doing this are doing is they're creating a strategy, and then alongside that they're creating a digital strategy, and the two interact. So, to finish it all, networks are going to go through, supply chain's going to go through a massive revolution. I met a very, very good friend the other day in a pub. There he is, dressed for work and relaxing at home. And we started to talk about this amazing new supply chain operating model that he'd come up with. And it was this, Skynet, okay? Now, I know it's science fiction, but actually, if you think about what's going to happen in our supply chains with the advent of Internet of Things, with the connectivity that's going on, the ecosystems that are slowly growing in supply chain, this could be the future of supply chains. It could be sort of this autonomous, homogeneous ecosystem, either that sits in an industry or sits globally, that manages the network. It's owned by everybody. It's for the good of everybody. It's human-free in the way it manages the supply chain. So I think, even though that's probably 20, 30 years away, I think that is a realistic view of what supply chains could look like in the future. I've gone probably 10 minutes over now. So I just wanted to finish on, as leaders, part of our role as leaders is about change and it's about innovation, okay? And to me, I think that supply chain suddenly now needs to step up to the plate, and it needs to start to become the sort of creative core of the organizations that it sits in. It used to be that the supply chain was where you went to when you wanted information. The supply chain needs to be the place that now gathers the information and creates the actionable data from that information. It needs to be a creative center, the creative heart of the organization. So, we've spoken a lot about, very quickly about, and I'm sorry, I blathered on about the digital. We talked about the disruptors. We've talked about some of the things that some of the leaders in the industry are doing, and talked a little bit about where the future's going to go. For me, this is going to be an absolutely amazing 10 years in supply chain. I think that the next 10 years are going to be like the last 50 years in supply chain. And I was probably around when logistics was invented. Now you're going to go through another 5 to 10 years of just the supply chains that we and the people that work for us are going to manage are going to be totally different to the ones we were managing 5 years ago. Thank you.